Well, hello again, everyone. This is the second of the Lyceum lectures. This one, after our first on the protocols of Zion, is a bit of change of pace. So rather than talk to you about history as much as I wanted to talk to you today about something that's a bit more to do with the present and something you may or may not know about. That something is the kosher food tax. If we can go to the next slide, please. So, what is it? You've probably seen these markings on your food. These are examples from different food stuff. So you've got one on pistachios here. You've got one on your tomato ketchup. You've got one on your Nutella. You've also got one on some other products. If we go to the next one, next slide, please. So the kosher food tax refers to the laws of kashrut in Judaism. Now, the laws of kashrut in Judaism are a complicated subject, to say the very, very least. I've quoted here Julian Neuberger writing in 1996 about it, to the effect that the laws of kashrut are hard for any Jew to understand, let alone any non-Jew. And also the fact that I think it's really important to bring out that, as Lawrence Hoffman and Morris Kurtzer wrote in 1993, that essentially that the laws of kashrut have no logical explanation for observation, nor in what they are. That's not to say, as they suggest, that Jews haven't tried to find reasons for them, because they have spent quite a lot of time and spilled a lot of ink on the subject. If you read anything about kashrut, you'll very quickly come upon people, for example, trying to rationalize why pigs are bad to eat, why pork is bad. You'll have every kind of rationalization under the sun for that. You'll also encounter various weird claims. For example, about Jews talking about how to get vitamin D into their diet and how kashrut helps with that, and things like that. There's lots and lots of these odd little claims that are running around in the literature on kashrut. But what does kashrut have to do with all these marks? Well, these are what we call kosher certification marks. Now, to give you some idea, what that really means is it's saying this product has been kosher certified by a Jewish organization, of which there are many, who essentially that's their whole purpose. Their purpose is to say, this is kasher, this is approved, you can eat this. There is an ancillary consideration here around whether or not the actual product is considered meaty, so fleischig, milky, milchig, or neutral, which is part. What that means for you in terms of kashrut itself is very minimal, but for those of you who want to know, it references the whole "thou shalt not eat a kid in its mother's milk" thing. Basically, it's saying you can't combine meat with milk, which is one of the best known aspects of kashrut. Essentially, you can put parv with anything, but you can't put meaty with milky, if you want to put it that way. But for our purposes here today, that is not very important, because kashrut, in terms of kashrut certification, doesn't really refer to that. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So what is the true origin of kashrut? Just to give you an idea of where it comes from. Now, a lot of people will try and claim it's to do with some ancient health advice or weird things like that. But the literature is pretty clear that it's to do with two things at the same time. And here I've quoted John Cooper, writing in 1993 about this. He summarized quite a few different theories, but the bulk of it is more or less what he's suggesting here, which is essentially that the Philistines and the Canaanites, who are the people in and around the Jews in Palestine, They had a they were very keen. They were very strong pagans. What did they tend to sacrifice? Pigs. Why pigs? Because pigs are they're one of the only animals we know of that have no other purpose really but sacrifice, but to eat. And they became very much the sine qua non of pagan so-called sacrifice, and the Greeks and Egyptians and the Romans and various other peoples have done the same with them. And of course, this upsets the Jews because the Jews were warring with the Philistines and the Canaanites. And of course, they want to separate themselves from them. And how do you do that? You kind of use food. It's an odd concept, but to a lot of people to these days. But if we think about it, this quote from Jordan Rosenblum in 2010 kind of brings it out when he's talking about cosmic commensality, which is the word. It's not a word that you hear often, but it essentially means eating together. Um, so essentially, what he's saying is that the reason the kashrut comes about is because Jews and non-Jews had a tendency in the Palestine area, and then later in the Greek and Roman Empire, the Greek empires and the Roman empires, to essentially eat together. And when they would eat, it was seen by the rabbis as a first step down the road to idolatry, because you're eating with non-Jews. Non-Jews are infecting your food. You're going to become a pagan. So this kind of roots from, in many ways, the Hellenizer versus the Maccabee debate, which occurred around the Seleucid era, whereby you had certain Jews who liked the concept of the Greek civilization. They saw Greek civilization was much better than anything that they had, so they copied it, versus the sort of more hardline rabbis, the Maccabees, and the proto-terrorists, if you want to call them that, who essentially hated the concept, and they said, okay, we want to pure Judaism. They're kind of the whole Wahhabis of the ancient world. So, as you probably know, eventually it is the Maccabees and the hardliners who win out. And what do we get from this? We get we get kashrut, and kashrut over time becomes more and more stringent. I'm not going to go through all the ins and outs of kashrut because that would be a whole lecture in of itself. But suffice to say, there's a lot of weird things in kashrut, and often they have to do with the presence or not presence of non-Jews. For example, one of the big things in kashrut is around milk and around alcohol and whatever. And basically, if milk is produced by a non-Jew, generally speaking, the stronger opinions are that you can't have it because it's tainted. The non-Jew has poisoned it, might be using it for cultic practices, might be sacrificing it to a statue, or they're just trying to kill you. Very, very similar in other things, and things like wine and alcohol and whatever. It's this kind of the kashrut is it can be quite intricate at times. It also links back into the hatred of everything non-Jewish, and the fact that they view non-Jews as what they call inherently they're influenced by they call the evil urge, the evil eye sometimes, whereby non-Jews habitually do horrible things. Like in the Talmud, we read of how that Jews think that non-Jews like to have sex with cows whenever Jews aren't looking, and this kind of thing. So that's the kind of mentality you're dealing with here. So if we move on to our next slide. What we've done here again is I've kind of taken it out and said, okay, what are the myths about kashrut certification and what is the truth? The myth is that kashrut certification is inexpensive. The truth is that kashrut certification, in fact, pushes the cost onto non-Jews. The myth is that there is a large kashrut market, and the truth is that the purely kashrut market, if you want to call it that, is small. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. The myth is that non-Jewish customers view kashrut as a sign of quality, when the actual truth is that only people who do this are non-Jewish prisoners. And I was talking very briefly to Fortunatia Christian about this in the chat before I came on, in that one of the reasons for this is because prison meals are frankly pretty disgusting. Um, so is there any way you can get a low batch, decently made with better ingredients meal is going to be a sign of quality. But generally speaking, cash there is no link between cash and quality whatsoever. Although Jews are quite keen to tell you otherwise. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So this is from a book, quote from a book from 2010 called by Sue Fishikov, called Kosher Nation. It's one of the literature on the kosher food and it's in modernity is relatively small. Literature on cash itself is extensive, but the actual literature on this subject in terms of what the kosher food tax is, rather what they refer to as just the kosher certification. We're referring it here to the kosher food tax because that's what it actually is. So here we've got Sue Fishkov basically talking about how Rabbi Eliezer Idlitz is estimating that only about three-quarters of the she refers to as the 1,000 agencies and individuals given Kosher certification are legitimate. Again, remember this is written in 2010. It's got worse since then. And what he and she is saying here is that there is literally 1,000, or there are 1,000 or thousands or 100 or a couple of hundred agencies and individual Jews who are engaging in such kosher certification, which comes back to something that the ADL were claiming back in the 1990s. So those who don't know, the idea of the kosher food tax really comes from a chap called Dr. Ed Fields, who did some work around it in the late 80s, early 90s. And he produced, I think, a couple of pamphlets about it. And the ADL picked up on this and they produced a little rebuttal script that they tend to do. And one of the things that they claimed in that script was that these co-certification agencies are not for profit. They are they're done basically because Jews are trying to help people. They're not profitable enterprises, and so on and so forth. And you often see this argument repeated. You'll see it repeated in Snopes. You'll see it repeated in the Boycott Watch article on this, who they actually plagiarize each other as it happens. And you see it also in any defense of the kosher food tax. Now, the problem with this is, as you can kind of imply from what Edlitz and Fishkov are saying here, is that fundamentally, if it is not profitable, why is there 1,000 agencies and individuals trying to do it? If it's really not profitable, you're going to get a couple at most of agencies and people trying to do it. So he goes to explain. He kind of brings us a little bit more meat on the bone when he says this means when he talks about some frauds. We've got Rabbi Chaim Fogelman of OK Kosher. He's referring to the OK here, which means OK Kosher. It's one of the big agencies for this. Basically, he's called up by a woman who has her restaurant certified as kosher, and this rabbi is turning up to certify it by eating her food and then tasting it, see, oh, do I like this food? And of course, that's not how kosher certification works whatsoever. But it kind of gives you an idea for how ridiculous it is. And then she also quotes another rabbi called Rabbi Adlerstein, basically saying he saw kosher certificates on Jewish butcher shops in Los Angeles and been given out by rabbis who have been dead for years, if not decades. Which again gives them idea. If you go back into literature, you find quite a lot of mention of this stuff. You hear a lot of Jews conning other Jews and non-Jews conning Jews, Jews conning non-Jews, all around this kashrut thing. But what we've kind of bringing out here is that there is something here. It's not just a little niche religious thing that someone uses. The truth is that it's actually clearly there's quite a lot of money kicking around in business, because why do you have so many agencies trying to do it? And why do you have fraudsters engaging in it? Because if something's not profitable, you're not going to get fraudsters charging around in it, let alone lots of them. So again, if we use the next slide, we can actually begin to see why. Now, this is from one of the very first books on the modern cash industry, written by Rabbi Seymour Friedman, and was published in 1970. And he's here saying essentially that there is a real problem, because for those who don't know, the cash certification really comes from the 1960s in America, and specifically in 1963, where the Orthodox Union, who we'll talk about a bit later, really kind of come up with this as a way to get around the problem of basically individual rabbi certifying. And originally, it wasn't meant for how it's being used now, but the point was more to allow them to kind of set a standard and hold to a standard, rather than to have one rabbi who's allegedly supervising like 10 butcher shops, but you can't do that in terms of kashrut. It's not possible. And what Friedman is talking about here is essentially that kosher meat, or is incredibly expensive, and that they're pricing people out, which kind of comes back to what we were just talking about. Is why would there be so many fraudsters hanging around this? Why would there be so many Jews trying to get in this, and fraudsters and whatever? Money. But the ADL says that there's no money in this. Well, clearly Friedman is saying here there is, and quite a lot. So what we're getting at here is that there is a huge market here, in the sense of there is a lot of money to be had by charging Jews through the nose for their special meat. And what happens from this? Well, we begin to develop what we call the kosher food tax from this. We have entities that are trying to promote it, but in truth, we can trace the concept of the kosher food tax itself back to really around the 1880s in New York, when the chief rabbinate of New York expected to fund themselves by taxing kosher meat. And this actually failed, because basically there were so many rabbis running around, they couldn't get them to basically give them money for whatever. And because the kosher meat business in New York was notoriously corrupt, as Jews and corruption go together like, well, flies on shit. Basically, they're attracted to one another. And the irony is that the rabbi concerned died in extreme poverty in 1902, because he couldn't get any money, because all the other Jews were stealing it. But it kind of gives you some idea. But we'll also, I think it's quite interesting to kind of bring out quite early on, and I think it's useful to do so anyway, is this idea that there is this massive market in this for this. Because to give you some idea, between 1914 and 1924, kosher meat consumption alone fell by 25 to 30% in the US and in Europe. In 1936, about 65% of American Jews just simply ignored the laws of kashrut, so they just didn't bother with them. In 1948, we have estimates that only 7% of Jews kept kosher. And 1953, we have a Jewish sociologist called Marshall Scolari found that less than 10% of Jews kept kosher in the US. So essentially, this is very much a thing, and this is supported by Friedman's analysis. So what happens? Well, what happens essentially is that Jews begin to kind of reconnect with their Jewishness around the 1960s and 70s, with the Israel's successes and the 6-Day War and whatever. So Jews begin to reconnect with themselves, with their ancestry a bit. So they do a bit more. They're a bit more observant. But the truth is that very few Jews really use kashrut in any meaningful sense. It's very much a minority thing, because what you'll see in a lot of arguments on the kosher food tax, and we'll kind of come into it again later, is that they say, "Oh yes, Jews use this." Okay, what Jews? Because again, not all Jews are the same. Some Jews are much more strict, other ones are not. So, is it are secular Jews using this? Not really. Are Reform Jews using this? Which, is, by the way, is the biggest, still the biggest branch of Judaism, at least nominally. No, not really. Conservative Jews, yeah, probably a bit. Orthodox Jews, yes, they're using it. Or ultra Orthodox and the Hasidim, yes, they certainly are. But also, do they have their own branches of it? Oh, yes, they do. So again, comes into why would the ultra Orthodox all have their own branches if it wasn't profitable? Why wouldn't they just use the Orthodox unions? That we're going to come to. But now for our next slide, if we go to the next slide, please, we have some evidence here. Now, what I wanted to do with you is to kind of bring up, why are what is it? If this is so unprofitable, why are Jews whinging about money, about the price of everything all the time? So here I've just reproduced some letters, 2 letters from the Jewish Telegraph in 2011. These are to give you some idea, the Jewish Telegraph is a sort of a local British Jewish newspaper from Manchester, has a large Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox community. And they just kind of talk about this. They kind of talk about how kosher food is really high. And also we hear things like, for example, in this letter from Peter Redstone, we begin to see some of the details of the kosher food tax and how it works. Because Peter Redstone is whinging about the concept of unstunned meat, and also he says kosher meat prices will have to be increased as parts of the animal usually sold to the non-Jewish market will be unsaleable due to enforced labeling. And basically, what he's actually saying here, for those who don't really understand what the issue is here, is essentially what's going on is you've got 2 things. First of all, you have shishishta, which we're going to talk about in a bit, which is the Jewish method of slaughtering animals, whereby you basically cut the animal's throat open. You hold it there and you just cut its throat open, and then you say a prayer as it bleeds horribly to death, usually a fairly long period of time. What they're saying is that this, because this will then require this to be labeled, because the thing that they don't tell you is that Judaism does not allow, kashrut and shisha do not allow meat to be stunned or pre-stunned before. So if a cattle comes in the cage, it can't be disorientated or be bashed on the head before it is killed. It must be alive, it must be conscious, it must be fully aware of what's happening to it, so it can feel all the pain and all the suffering. It's very, very unpleasant. And so what they're saying here is this meat is taken from this animal that's been kosher slaughtered, and then if it is not suitable by according to a shoshetim, a Jewish ritual slaughterer, and it's not because they have a series of things, of inspections and whatever they have to do depending on the severity and the strength of the kashrut and all that jazz. It will be then given to the non-Jews to eat, and who benefits by that? Jews, because a shoshetim has been employed. The shoshetim is then paid in part by selling the bits and all the complete animals that are considered non-kosher after kosher slaughter to the non-Jews to eat. So you could be eating your next, I don't know, steak or whatever. You have no idea that a Jew has sliced that cow across the throat and has been saying prayers over it, their Jewish prayers over it, as it is bleeding out on the floor, because they don't want to tell you that. That's information they don't really want to keep for you, because if they told you that, you might not buy it. You would buy a different cut of meat. You'd buy it from a different source. This is the root of the whole labeling debate around in kashrut and shishishta, and specifically around, and also why Jews like to kind of divert this off towards Islam, because they say Islam, Islam is like it's really, the problem is really halal. No, it's not, because was it 80-90% halal butchery allows pre-stunning. Only only shisha doesn't allow pre-stunning. And basically, this has been true since the 1920s and 30s, when the anti-Semitic leader of the Imperial Fascist League, Arnold Leese, who was himself a vet, so he's a veterinary surgeon, had quite a lot of experience in the Egypt, places like that during the First World War. He talked about this and said basically Muslims are quite open to having it pre-stunned as a kind of, as a way of being nice to the animal and make sure it doesn't feel pain, whereas Jews are quite desperate to make it feel pain and have it suffer. The other letter is from Dennis Fisher, and it says much the same thing. But again, it's moaning about the fact that it's going to be so expensive. And he says, for example, the inescapable factors in the not so distant future, kosher food in general, and Passover, which we've just started, so it's a good time to talk, will become the exclusive domain of the committed, for whom no sacrifice is too great, and the wealthy, for whom any amount can be spent without jeopardizing anything else. Basically, and he goes on to say, people will tell me supervision is expensive. Do we have hordes of hibernating shomlim worldwide who suddenly make an appearance pre-Pesach to possibly earn large amounts in a few weeks? Our Rabbonim have no qualms about standing in the pulpit exhorting the congregation to donate to the needy who can't afford to make Pesach. So why can't they exhort the retailers to reduce their prices, take less profit, and make it easier for people to keep kosher? So Dennis Fisher there is talking about how expensive stuff is, and there's one of these sort of sub areas of kashrut around Pesach or Passover, which we're now in, whereby Jews have to have the kashrut level like doubles or triples in severity. So you have to have even higher levels, and a lot of Jews who don't keep kosher normally then have to become kosher during Pesach, and this phenomenon known as kosher for Pesach. So they essentially engage in that, and then the Jews are stinging each other for large amounts of money for specialist kosher. So this kind of stuff is where the kosher food tax is not being used. What is happening is this is specialist. This is you're going to a Jewish butcher shop and buying a specific cut of meat. You're going and buying special foods that have things like hamnets in them, which you can't have around Pesach and that kind of thing. So we move on to the next slide. We get the very, very similar thing. I've reproduced here that we've got the Jewish media weighing in on this issue. We've got Angela Epstein in the Jewish Chronicle in 2016, basically moaning about the sheer amount of money it costs to keep kosher, because saying basically it says at the end, as one chapter I bump into by the chill section of our delicatessen, meaning Jewish delicatessen, last week opined, while we had a mutual moan about the price of fish, because smoked salmon, because fish is a common kosher dish. At this rate, it won't be a simulation that finishes off the Jews; it'll be the butcher's bill. Basically, again saying that the costs involved are extremely high, and the same is true for Herb Scribner writing in 2016 again around the cost of kosher again, because this is 2016. For those who give you some context, a report came out from within the Jewish community in Britain, stipulating that the cost of kosher was huge. It was costing them like another, in this case, say it can cost British Jews around £13,000 a year, which is about $19,000 extra to live a kosher lifestyle. So that's just buying from Jewish specialist things. And I think what really we need to kind of understand in that is that is with the kosher food tax being in place. Because as we're going to see, the purpose of the kosher food tax originally was to make sure that Jews don't have to spend a lot of money, basically don't have to spend a lot of money by keeping kosher. They want to make it so that so the cost is sloughed off on the non-Jews, so that basically Shlomo Goldstein can have his gefilte fish at a reasonable, or what he might consider more reasonable cost, rather than being a $20 in the store. It's going to be $8 or something, because we're going to get the goyim to eat it instead. And they do this, of course, by basically having the non-Jews eat it and thus pay for it, and basically by making non-Jewish food kosher. So again, he goes through this, and if I believe you'll be able to download this, so you'll be able to read some of these at your leisure. But we also have in the next slide, we have another one from 2011 where Yael Miller writes in the Haaretz about it, and just basically saying again what we've kind of said before, the Jews are basically ripping each other off like crazy around kashrut. So if we go to the next slide, we've got an even more recent one from Tabby Raphael, writing in the Jewish Journal in 2021, around this, and saying basically Jews are charging $24 for kosher pizza slices to each other without toppings. That's $25 for a box of kosher donuts, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of where you're coming from here. You've basically got Jews ripping each other off like crazy. Yes, you're right. Yeah. So they're basically ripping each other off like crazy. And this is, again, with the kosher food tax in place. Can you imagine how bad this would have been or would be without the kosher food tax? When Hitler said that Israel would be a den of thieves, it would be the most corrupt country on the planet in his Mein Kampf, as you probably all kind of remember or recall. This is the kind of thing he was talking about. This is the kind of thing that we wouldn't do to each other, but they do. This is the true face of the Jew. This is what they do to each other when they think we're not looking. So again, if we move on to our next slide, which is a repeat of the previous slide, but that is deliberate. And the reason it is deliberate is because I wanted to kind of remind you of the fact that they were moaning about the cost of kosher in 1970, in the 1960s and 70s. So it's not like it's not like it's just happened in the 2000s. This has been going on since at least the 60s and the 50s, and you can trace it all the way back to the 1900s. So again, if we go to the next slide, this is Friedman talking about how this actually works. So he actually is very, very blunt, because he says often in large production, the fact that thousands of pieces of the product are produced makes it possible for the companies to absorb the minimal cost of the kosher supervision without substantially raising the market price of the item. The observant housewife can keep kosher without depleting her budget any more than does her non-kosher neighbor who buys processed foods. You can kind of see what's happening here. Jews have realized that the cost of kosher is incredibly high. They can't trust each other to actually keep prices down, because this is not a for-profit. This is not a charitable business. This is a business, a proper business, and they are screwing each other left, right, and center. So they've kind of realized at this point they need to go to mainstream manufacturers, get mainstream products made, if you want to call it, safe for Jews. They want to have it so that, if you go to a Walmart, that you can buy a bag of chips, and the Jew will be fine with that bag of chips, generally speaking. It's not about you. It's not about making the food better for you. It is making about the food acceptable and okay for Jews. But as we shall see, the business itself becomes something quite different over time. It becomes not about that at all. It becomes about how much money can they generate from this. And we'll go to the next slide now. So this is one of probably the premier book that's been published around the whole kosher certification and the business of it. It was published in 2013 by Harvard, authored by Timothy Litton. It's quite a hard read at times, but nevertheless it is useful. And I thought it's a very easy way to explain the kosher food tax to you without kind of going through it and dealing with some of what Litton says and what he doesn't say with this particular quote. He begins An initial inspection of the processing plant and periodic follow-up visits are sufficient for industrial certification, in contrast to meat production, which requires paying for the services of a shochet, Jewish slaughterer, and constant on-site rabbinic supervision of slaughtering and butchering. Now, what he's actually saying here is that you've got two different things going on. What are those two different things? You have got meat production. Now, meat production is where there's actually a kosher slaughterer, a shochet or shochetim, for the plural, who is on site, who has to do the slaughtering or supervising it. Now, mostly they'd have to do it themselves. They can't have non-Jews do it, but that's not to say that they haven't had non-Jews do it, because we know of particularly the Postville incident where Jews were primarily supervising non-Jews. They weren't actually doing it themselves. So what he's saying is that's one thing that requires a lot of work, but he's referencing that there is an element here of, oh, okay, we're going to turn up at the factory, and this particular product doesn't require a lot of on-site supervision. Therefore, it's a relatively cheap phenomenon, is what he's getting at. I would disagree with this, because I think Lytton is being deliberately, shall we say, naive here. And it kind of comes into what he says next, where he says the moreover, the cost of industrial supervision can be spread across tens of or thousands of unit sales. Any increase in unit cost is likely to be made up by increased sales to kosher consumers, meaning that the company need not increase the price of the product in most cases. Now, the problem with this view is kind of comes back to what we just said, that it assumes that every single Jew is buying kosher or deliberately buying kosher. And as we already kind of brought out, this is not true. Most of the kosher product, the kosher market is a very small section of the Jewish community. Say roughly, I would say most 20%. If we say 20% of the Jewish community actively keeps kosher, that means that's 20% of 2%. So what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with 0.4% of the US of the US population as a market, roughly. So it kind of gives you some idea for how stupid a lot of this is. That they're essentially saying that yes, it's okay. It's not a huge cost to the business per se, because the rabbi turns up and walks around and says, "Oh yeah, it's fine, whatever," and then walks away. The problem comes in what Lytton doesn't say here. So, for example, if you because most people who are going to do this are in a food business of some kind, there is an ancillary thing that they have branched into in recent years, which is they've started certifying water. So, for example, if you look at your San Pellegrino water, next time you're out or drinking it, you'll see it is kosher certified. Now, how on earth you kosher certify water is beyond me, but Jews have done it. So every time you probably should not drink San Pellegrino. So again, coming back to that point, we also have other things that are there has been a rise in kosher certified clothing. So if you want to get in the casual around clothing, it's a bit like Islam. You can't have two different kinds of fabric in natural fabric in a piece of clothing, for example. So you can't have I think wool and cotton you couldn't have. I'd have to look at the actual kasher itself, but it's that kind of thing. Plus, cleaners. There is now kosher provision of industrial cleaners to make sure that they are suitably kosher. I mean, I don't know why bleach needs to be checked for kashrus, but apparently Jews think it does all of a sudden. And this kind of comes into something that we'll kind of bring out later, which is that Kashrus originally really focused on a couple of different things. It doesn't really have a lot to do with things like industrial cleaners and clothes and water. And there's a lot of things that used to be assumed to be kosher, to be completely kosher friendly, which are now, they need kosher supervision. Why? Because money. And this kind of comes into what Lytton is saying here, in that fundamentally it's yes, it sounds cheap, but the but is, well, okay, say you run a business. That business, you get a rabbi in to kosher inspect your business. The rabbi then turns around and says, "Oh no, yeah, you're mostly fine, but there are some things here that need to change. For example, you use animal gelatin in your product. This is not kosher. You need to use another kind of gelatin. Oh yeah, but that other gelatin is going to cost you another, and it's going to cost you another per unit. It's going to cost you another two cents. But oh yeah, but I know a Jewish manufacturer who can give you that for 1 cent. So only a 1 cent increase. So what's happened there is that, for example, you have given another cent per unit to a Jewish manufacturer who will then give that money in time back to the Jewish community in some way, shape, or form. But also, the another cent has gone out of your pocket potentially because because a Jew has come in and said that's the wrong kind of gelatin. That's what you're kind of dealing with, but you're also dealing with things like what we might call gearing up costs. So, for example, if a rabbi comes into your business and says, "Oh no, that's wrong," that potentially involves quite a lot to spend. Like eventually, there's quite a lot of money to be spent to change machinery, change industrial processes, change supply chain things, everything, all this kind of stuff, change food handling even. And in order to have this little certification thing that allegedly is going to bring in all these customers that, as we've already been talking about, don't in fact exist. So when we're talking about this, we can kind of see what's happening here is that they're trying to obfuscate the fact that there is a potential significant unit cost increase. Now, it's not going to be like, $1 each, probably. It's going to be something like a cent, 2 cents, maybe 3 cents a unit. But that adds up. If you're selling hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of units and in just one product line that has been kosher certified, and there's an increase of a cent on that, that's a lot of money that's being taken out of basically your pocket and my pocket, as well as the US tax base, in order for Jews to give at least in part to Jews. And that is where we're coming to with the kosher food tax. That is what it is. It's a way to pick your pocket without you realizing it. And again, coming back to what Lynn's saying here, he says all this makes kosher certification a highly attractive marketing strategy for food companies. And he said, and what this is he's saying this is a common trope inside the literature on kashrut and on the kosher food tax in general. What they're saying is that it's this marketing strategy. It's an amazing marketing. It's low cost. Nothing is going to be a problem, and it's going to increase your foodstuffs. The truth is that there's no evidence I can find that it massively increases people sales. I mean, there is a particular example cited by the ADL of Birdseye, who did this, who claimed that it did that, but Birdseye didn't. There's no study attached to it. It's just Birdseye saying that when after they had purchase after they'd gotten kosher certification, they had a significant increase in sales. There's nothing to attach the two things. It could just be because people people particularly like their fish sticks that particular year. There's no link. And he goes on to say, in addition to the case of kosher meat certification, growth and demand for industrial certification services does not require that consumers eat kosher or that kosher customers eat more. It merely requires that kosher customers purchase more other business food. In essence, what he's saying here again is that it's sloughing the cost off onto non-Jews and causing Jews to be able to purchase more the kind of food that we would buy in Walmart or Target or Kmart or whatever. So if we go into our next slide, we kind of come up to this kind of thing. So around what is going on with how Jews are making the shishta work. Now, we've kind of talked a little bit about shishta, but this kind of brings you one study from 2017 and one study from 2022, one Spanish, one British, where basically they are detailing that large numbers of kosher sacrificed cattle essentially are being thrown into the Gentile system without people realizing that they're eating it, that they're eating the food that is basically been rejected by Jews but has been sacrificed by Jews, but as such the cost of that food has in some way been paid to the Jews directly or indirectly. So it gives you some idea for just the scale of it, and that you're dealing with over half of the animals that they are killing with this method. They are being thrown back into the non-Jewish supply chain to be eaten by people like you and me. And that's not just in the UK and Spain. That's true in the US. It's true in Canada. It's true pretty much all over the Western world. So we're going to our next slide. So this is where I'm going to give you a little bit of a break, but if you find an animal being in distress disturbing, I would suggest you put this on silent for about 6 minutes, because Flood is going to play you a clip of what Shishishta actually looks like. And it's not pleasant, I do warn you, but the reason this is in here is because I wanted you to understand how evil what we're talking about is. And it's not an easy thing, but I think it's important that we not look away and we understand what we're dealing with. Vlad, if you want to take it away.
Supposedly, their religion forbids Jews from eating ordinarily butchered meat. So they let the animals bleed to death while conscious. The Jews deceptively describe this cruel method as the most humane way to slaughter. European science has long acknowledged the torturous character of this type of slaughter. In 1892, the people voted to ban it in Switzerland. Jewish law has no love and respect for animals in the Germanic sense. It's even forbidden that the suffering animal be put out of its misery. The National Socialist movement has opposed this cruel torture of defenseless animals since its earliest days. In nearly all provincial elections and in the parliament, we moved to forbid this form of slaughter. But the entire Jew-controlled press called our stand disgraceful. The Jewish press could only get away with writing this because hardly any Germans had ever seen a kosher slaughter. Considering the well-known German love of animals, it would otherwise have been impossible for the Jews to continue their cruel torture of innocent and defenseless animals unpunished. These scenes prove the cruelty of this method of slaughter. They also reveal the character of a race that hides its senseless brutality behind the facade of pious religious customs. The Jewish butchers usually bind the animals so that no movements betray their agonies, but it's customary to sometimes slaughter unbound animals in this way. Right after the Fuhrer took power, a law enacted April 21st, 1933, forbade the Jewish form of slaughter. It decreed that all warm-blooded animals be given anesthetic before slaughter.
So you just saw the Eternal Jews sequence, rather famous sequence, for the kosher food tax, for what happens with the shishta, and I'm sure that was a hard watch. It's not very fun, but it gives you an idea for what you're dealing with. These people are not they're not normal in that regard, and this is what they're putting animals through, and what they're defending. But coming back onto what the kosher food tax is, what it essentially is a Ponzi scheme. And what we've got in front, of you is what we call the diagram on the left is how Ponzi schemes work. The diagram on the right is what we call the fraud triangle. Now, you saw Lytton talking about how it's about all marketing and whatnot, and how important that is. Well, think of it this way: if you look at the fraud triangle on the right, you'll see that basically it's centered around the concept of, I'm going to miss out. This fits pressure, motivation. I'm missing out on a potential opportunity. There's going to be a problem if I don't do it. Someone else is going to take it from me, and whatever. And Lytton and Co.'s argument and the ADL's argument is that it's the classic rational economic man fallacy. Oh, people wouldn't do it if it wasn't profitable. The truth is, people do it because they think if they don't do it, someone else will, and it's a way. And if they sort of say no to it, then they're going to when they get sacked, someone else is going to go and do it. It's the same logic as outsourcing. It's not that it's actually a good idea for the business or that the business profits from it. It's the fear of missing out. It's FOMO, essentially, which is kind of how the fraud works. It's about, basically, as Rabbi has turned up to you and said, well, are you servicing this 2% of the US population? Oh, but did you know Seventh-day Adventists also use kosher food certification, which they don't really. There's some of them that do, but not really. And they also claim that Muslims use their kosher certification, which they don't either. They don't. They would, in a pinch, they might, but generally speaking, they don't. So essentially, Jews are promoting this idea that you have to buy into this. Now, where does the Ponzi scheme come in? Well, think of it this way. If you have a scheme whereby you're not selling anything, so they're not actually selling any actual product. They are selling a license, a tag, in the same way. It's like an NFT almost, saying, "Oh, we endorse this product." Essentially, what's happening is you are pushing up your profits. You're always pushing your profits and paying out to your organization, the organization that owns you. So the promoter in this case would be the organization behind the kosher certification, or the individual rabbi. And you've got various levels. You've got salesmen going down and pushing for new people to invest. The investors are the people who are going kosher. They are, they're buying into this idea. So they're pushing money into this in order to get as much as they can, in order to try and get this, get these extra customers that they think they're going to get, because they're being sold this by a rabbinical salesman, or some other guy who just comes and says, "Oh, what about this particular market?" It's a common trope you get with a lot of these organizations when they try and sell these things to you. You get this concept of like the kosher pound, the pink pound, always, oh, but you're not selling to this audience. Well, why would I want to sell to that audience? Is it actually worth my time? And the truth is, it's not. But in order for it to work, they're constantly trying to sell you on the fact that this 0.4% of the population that might be interested in this is going to, is going to walk away from your business otherwise. Well, do I really care if 0.4% of the population don't want to buy, my not particularly kosher meat products? The answer is no. But a lot of people will worry, particularly in how modern capitalism and how modern business works. They're going to worry about that because it's their jobs. They think they're going to lose profit, and so on and so forth. It's a very simple concept, a very old concept, but it's a concept that fundamentally it defines modernity in many ways. And when we look at this, we're looking at basically you're being used as a funding mechanism, essentially, is how it's working. Now, in order to understand this, let's go and work through probably the biggest example that we have, which is, if you go to the next slide, Flood, which is the Orthodox Union. So the Orthodox Union has been around since the 19th century. It's been around for quite a while. So it's probably the largest of the lot. So it's circa 70% of the global market share. It makes a reported revenue of around 40 million a year, and it's non-profit and tax exempt. Now, I'm pretty sure the actual reported annual revenue figure is much lower than it actually is, and there's a whole small little literature around of Jews complaining about the Orthodox Union, saying the Orthodox Union is basically lying to everyone, and they're running basically a racket. But for your purposes, and I've kind of highlighted it on the Orthodox Union's logo to the right, the key organizations for our purposes here within the Orthodox Union is their Kosher service and the Orthodox Union Advocacy Center. Now, if we go on to our next slide, you'll see what is the Orthodox Union Advocacy Center. Well, it is, so when you hear about they're funding the synagogues, for security grants and whatever. Who are the people who are lobbying your congressmen, using your senators? It's the Orthodox Union. And you can see from this, just some of the figures are eye-watering. They got through this year. This is this year. They've got through security grant funding for 300 million. So the Orthodox Union has played a big role in basically ensuring that Jewish groups get $300 million of your money as US taxpayers to defend their synagogues. And if we look on look at the example to the right, it's also from this year, and they're advocating now for $500 million. So to give you some idea, all these kind of numbers have gone up from around 100, so about 50, 100 million before. So now we're getting towards the 100. We're sort of really rapidly getting towards the half billion potentially mark, depending which billion kind of definition of billion you use. But so essentially, that's what's happening, is that when you buy that bit of that bottle of Heinz ketchup with that union with that kosher tag on it, you are contributing to the Orthodox Union Advocacy Center, who then are lobbying your congressman to take even more money out of your pocket. And how they're doing that? They're doing it via government grants. So what I did, just go to the next slide, is I went and mapped this for you to kind of explain this to you. Now, this is just the Orthodox Union. There are hundreds of these organizations. This is just one. This is maybe the biggest, but it's also just one. And it's one of it, and there's a couple of big ones. There's OK Kosher, you got Kof K, you got people like that. So it's not like it's unique. So we have the Orthodox Union in the center. The Orthodox Union has a cash certification scheme. The cash certification scheme goes and picks the pocket of companies. So it's talking to companies. The companies and US International pay the Orthodox Union. But they also pay by default, as we kind of talked about, by how, recommending, suppliers and appropriate people to help and whatever. They're also paying the Jewish diaspora. And so then what happens with that? Well, then all of a sudden, you as US taxpayers are now paying more money to the US international companies, who in essence are paying the Jewish diaspora and the Orthodox Union money, so they can access, quote unquote, their product. But also there is a side benefit of the Jewish diaspora community getting significantly reduced costs, which allows the Jewish diaspora community to fund the Orthodox Union a bit more, but also to send more money to Israel. Further, when we look at it and we look at it the other way, the Orthodox Union the Orthodox Union's Advocacy Center is lobbying the government for grants, and it's also advocating on behalf of Israeli interests in Congress. So they are also picking the pocket of the U.S. taxpayers to ensure that US taxpayers pay hundreds of millions of dollars every year for the Orthodox Union and groups like it, so that they can make sure, quote unquote, that the synagogue security is okay. And you can pretty much guess that money is also going to be used very heavily to fund their further activities, as well as being given back to the Jewish diaspora community. As well as they're also in the way funding the Jewish diaspora again, because guess who benefits the Jewish diaspora? And also, what happens is the US government is then funding Israel because of what the Orthodox Union Advocacy Center has suggested, among others, as part of the AIPAC, NORPAC, all J Street, all these different organizational entities. Is one of them. And then they advocate for you, the US taxpayer, to give money to Israel. So as you can see, it might seem like a very small thing, but then it's actually part of a web. That web is what is helping to fund what is going on in Iran, what is going on in Lebanon, what is going on in Palestine, what is going on the war against whites in the US and Europe. That is what's going on, and this is what they're doing. They're partially using to fund it. They're basically using your own shopping habits against you. They're skimming you. They're coin clipping you. Just it's a modern version of coin clipping, essentially. They're saying, oh, okay, you want to spend, $2 on a bottle of ketchup. We will take 10 cents of that, and you can just you can have the same ketchup, but we'll just take 10 cents of that. And then we'll use that. We'll kind of add that up. We'll collect it over time. We'll use it to buy a bomb to drop on your neighbors. That's essentially how it works. So again, if we move on to the next slide, we can see a rabbi quoted by Sufishkov basically saying as much when he's a Rabbi Baruch Halevai saying it's not truly about kashrut or ethics anymore. It's about something else. Power, money, political loopholes is a system that has run amok. Basically, the kashrut system has completely and utterly gone crazy. Now, to help you kind of understand this a bit, I thought it'd be interesting to bring up a couple of case studies of how this works in practice. If you want to go to the next slide, Flood. So you probably don't know that not only are they picking your pocket it's at Walmart, at the big box stores and whatever, they are picking your pocket in the prisons as well. So what do they do? What do I mean by that? Well, essentially, The average meal in the cost per day for a per prisoner for the state of Minnesota are between $1.2 and $3 a day. While in California, it costs about $3.32 per day to feed each prisoner. In the state of Florida, it costs a mere $1.54 a day. Not a lot of money. But bear in mind that the state of Texas, for example, spends circa 183.5 million per year on food for prisoners, while the state of California spends circa 140 million per year on the same. Thus, we can see that while the cost per prisoner is low, the amount of prisoners is huge, and any increase in that cost per meal will disproportionately increase the budget. That is where the kosher food comes into the picture. Now, for those who don't know, and I think 48 Christian was kind of alluding to this earlier, there has been a spate of lawsuits in recent years by prison inmates who aren't actually Jewish, but wish to keep kosher for different reasons, such as being a Messianic Jew, which is basically being a Christian, but being Jewish at the same time, allegedly, or they've converted to Judaism. So conversion seems to account for the majority of such requests. For example, in Texas, 900 inmates labeled themselves as Jewish, while only 70, i.e., 7.7% of those, wish to keep kosher. But yet, some 90 non-Jews. So Texas has 900 inmates who are basically say that they're Jewish in origin. Only 70 of these wanted to keep kosher. That's 7.7%. But yet 90 non-Jews were in the process of converting to Judaism, which is quite scary, which is an increase of 128% of the population requiring kosher food. Again, it's a small number of people, but bear in mind that these 70 inmates cost the state of Texas $88,000 per year to provide kosher food, i.e. $3.44 a day. Bear in mind again that Texas isn't spending a hell of a lot of money on normal inmates, but they're spending an awful lot on Jewish inmates who want to keep kosher. And while it would cost another $8,000 to set up a program of just normalizing kosher food, which is again, it's coming out to what I talked about earlier in regard to gearing up costs. So if these 90 prisoners in the process of converting to Judaism successfully convert, then it jumps to the total cost of $201,142 per year just to feed kosher food to a measly 160 inmates. And Texas is not alone in this either. Since the New York Times wrote in 2014 that in Florida's prison system, which faces a $58 million deficit, money is the easy answer for the battle against kosher food. The cost of 3 kosher meals in Florida is $7 a day, a big jump from the $1.54 for standard meals. In New York State, where 1,500 inmates out of 56,000 keep kosher, the cost of a kosher meal is $5 per person. In California, where some prisons even have kosher kitchens, the price tag is $8, and the meals are served to 0.7% of about 120,000 inmates. Thus, we can see that providing kosher food is expensive for much of the same reason that providing vegan meals in prison is extremely expensive. Indeed, vegan meals are actually kosher. Because plant-based food is traditionally considered to be completely kosher and completely okay for Jews to eat. Because then coming back to what kosher is, it doesn't violate the milchig, the milky versus the fleischig, the meaty distinction. And saladin, for example, in general, is just generally considered to be kosher. But Jews, like I have said, have expanded the definition, expanded. Because in order to make it, they require kosher certification to get a salad, essentially. So the Idaho Department of Corrections oddly recognized this fundamental fact in 2019 and simply provided those inmates with a kosher diet requirement with vegan food, which is quite intelligent for them, because that's actually true. That's actually correct in terms of kashrut. And of course, and while they reacted to the festival of Pesach, Passover, and the additional dietary restrictions by feeding inmates requiring kosher food on fresh fruit and matzo donated by the local Jews. So basically, the Idaho Department of Corrections got it completely right, because they realized that Jews had been selling them a complete crock of shit. that fundamentally they didn't need to get special kosher meals. All they needed to do was pay for vegan food, and then basically give Jews a bunch of fruit and free matzo, so basically flat unleavened bread, donated by the Jewish community on Pesach, and that was it. That's all they need to do. They don't need to pay $8 for special kosher food, or $7 or whatever. So essentially, you've kind of got the Idaho Department of Corrections kind of leading the way in this. So what do I mean by how this all works? Well, the interesting thing is that when you kind of table this up, in that when you add in kosher food and you whatever to the equation, basically the food bill for inmates jumps by millions quite quickly. For example, in Florida in 2016, 2017, after the series The Orange is the New Black began to air, they basically, a bunch of inmates decided they wanted to convert to Judaism and began pretending to be Jews in order to get different food. And it cost them millions to do that. For example, the cost, because again, it comes back to the fact that the cost of a kosher meal to the California Department of Corrections is 3 times that of a normal meal, while the Florida Department of Corrections is a 4-fold increase. And all it is fundamentally that this money goes straight to Jewish groups, because the people who provide these kosher meals, specialist ones, are the kosher certification groups. They're the same ones. So the Orthodox Union has its own little company that does this, and pretty much they all do. And so when you see those kind of meals on flights, they come from these kind of groups. So it's a direct profit. It's a highly profitable business for them. So naturally, they charge them the prison system through the nose. It gives you some idea for the scale of it, and why so many Jews are skeptical that the Orthodox Union only makes $40 million a year. They think it makes a lot more money than that, probably 10 times that. So we come into our next case study after that. So next slide. Yep. So, which is a bit of a one-word bit of, most people don't realize. They think, okay, well, the kosher food tax is American. Well, it's not only that; it applies to other countries too, and it applies to Britain. For example, as of December 2016, there were 449 prisoners who have been positively identified as Jewish in the British prison system, which is up from 327 prisoners in 2011. There are no statistics available around how many keep kosher, but if we use the US example that we just talked about of 7.7%, we round up to 10 for the sake of argument. That would mean about 45 of those 449 would require kashrut. So the cost of kosher meals in prison in the United Kingdom is £8 per day, which is roughly around $10 to $11, which you can always see the increase, rather than the $2 a day it costs to feed inmates, i.e., so it's 4 times as much, just like in Florida. The total cost of feeding observant Jewish inmates per day would be £360, or a whopping £131,400 a year, which isn't much, but then put it against the same number of non-Jewish inmates, and you see the difference. To feed the same number of non-Jews costs £98 per day, and a measly £35,770 per year. So again, the cost is absolutely a huge difference. Or put another way, you could feed 180 non-Jews for the cost of feeding 45 Jews. The whole concept is quite simple, in that when we take the example of HMP, Her Majesty's Prison Edinburgh, 121 inmates on normal fare cost £242 per day, i.e. 121 times £2, or £88,330 per year. So the average, and if we use that, and if we use the statistics that we provide, we've got for them, then the cost of supplying kosher food to Her Majesty's Prison Edinburgh which is happily provided oddly by the Daily Mirror of all people, we get the cost of £629 per day, £629.20, sorry, per day, and £229,658 per year, as in you're dealing with roughly about 3 to 4 times as much. So putting this way, it costs a huge amount of money just to actually supply kosher food to these organizations. And it's not just these. We've got there's other prisons where this applies to, like Hamash's prison, Glenorchill, and places like that. You've also got HMP Manchester. The same is true of them, and it's pretty much true all over. What I'm getting at here is fundamentally is that what's happening is that these prisons, the prison systems in Britain and the US are being raided by the cash certification or groups for money as another way to generate large amounts of money. This comes into what I referred to why I was talking about the Ponzi scheme. Essentially, they're pushing the sources of revenue out into these different areas now. They're really pushing hard because they're running out of traditional groups to kind of companies to con. So they're coming up with incredibly new strict concepts. They're coming up with new areas of focus. They're coming up with you need to provide X, Y, Z to your prisoners. So you have to pay us money to do it. So essentially, it's a very, very greedy con that's coming out here, and it's costing the British and the American taxpayers a lot of money to fund it. So again, it comes down to a simple way of understanding the world, that unless you're anti-Semitic, you don't really have a control over what is going on in your with your budgets, because Jews are just basically coin clipping you again for as much money as they can possibly get by basically using a scam. So our third example, if you use the next slide, is one that is a lot more recent. Because when I was talking about they've really pushed it to new areas, and prisons would be an obvious example of that. What they've done is they've kicked it off to free school lunches as well. So there's been lots of new legislation in recent years that has really pushed this. And a good example of that is you've got, for example, you had the free school lunches that came in on behalf of the 30,000 yeshiva students in New York City in, I think it was 2024 or 2023, maybe in 2024. I tell a lie, it was 2017, but it is now well in advance. So essentially, what's happened is that the taxpayers of New York and New York State are paying for 30,000 yeshiva students, and yeshiva, so that was the ultra orthodox. Those are the Jews studying the Talmud in their little halls. The Jews who came up from the tunnels. These are the people. So essentially, what's going on is that the Orthodox Union has lobbied the governor of New York, and has gotten this through. What it essentially means is that the New York City is purchasing 30,000 meals a day for Jewish yeshiva students from the Orthodox Union. And you can kind of see how this tabs up really, really quickly. So if we say there was these 30,000 yeshiva students, the cost per year to the taxpayers of New York would be $23,400,000, or $90,000 a day, on top of the cost of feeding and cost of any of additional sort of cost of those feeding any additional people. It all kind of tabs out at around potentially about $50 million to $100 million as a year, and going into the coffers of groups like the Orthodox Union. So again, it gives you some idea for the scale of it. But because I know floods in California, this is actually just very recently happened in California as well. It's the Senate Bill 1080 SB 1080, called the Halal and Kosher School Meals Act, which was passed in April 2024 and came into effect in 2025-2026. Essentially, it requires that large numbers of California's taxpayers pay for Jews to have free school lunches, and also so that any cafeteria school cafeteria where a free school lunches are provided, we kosher certified. Who benefits from that? People like the Orthodox Union. And for example, the Orthodox Union in fact spent $614,000 in 2017 alone lobbying the US government, to give you some idea of the scale of the operation for this kind of thing. So they're not, it's very, very blatant, it's very, very dishonest, but it's just how they work. So to give you some idea, I worked out that given that there aren't a great many observant Jews in California anymore, that roughly it's going to cost California taxpayers around $800,000 at least per year on the conservative side to do this. But it gives you some idea of the scale of this, that we're talking tens and hundreds of millions of dollars at a given time from single sources of income for these groups. And as you remember from earlier, they're claiming, oh, we're not doing it for profit. This is why they're doing it. It's huge amounts of money kicking around. So our last example, if we go and move on to the next one, is the concept of glatt kosher. Now, for those who don't understand why I would say something that there's another kind of kosher, there is what I've referred to here is about this creep in kosher, in that they've become more and more extreme. And the obvious example of that is glatt kosher. Now, glatt kosher, for those who don't know, is basically kosher on crack. It is the most strident, extreme opinions. There is even a level now they've actually gone beyond glatt kosher into the most extreme possible opinions to push this kind of idea of, you need to sign up with us because we have the most extreme kosher observance imaginable. But the concept is very, very simple. It's basically they're pushing for more money, saying, oh, we're giving you better things, but in fact they're not doing anything of the kind. They're just basically throwing out junk to you and then saying, oh yeah, you got to pay a premium for it. That's kind of how it works. That's what they're doing, and you can sort of see that in the fact that the most recent thing they're going after is beer. Now, it's not really a thing where you kind of think of kosher certification of beer, but the truth is because beer is traditionally considered to be halal. It's neutral. It's not considered to be. It's not meaty, milky. It's considered just to be naturally kosher. It's a bit like a salad in the theory. But the truth is they're going after it because it's a massive market. They want to get their claws into the beer drinkers. They want to make beer drinkers pay them as well. So there's a whole thing now around they're trying to get beer companies to basically kosher certify their beer with them. So when you go into your next, to the bar, whatever, and have a look at what beers you're buying, because some of them are going to start to be kosher certified in relatively short order, and so just be careful. I think is the real message there. Just be careful and don't buy into it. Okay, we've kind of come to the end of the case studies. So with the case studies, I really wanted to kind of end with that. If we go to the next slide, Flood. I asked you the question of how can you avoid this? How can you stop? What can you do? And the simplest answer is the simplest stuff. It's know your kosher food tax symbols. Don't buy kosher. If you Google kosher food, kosher fox tax. Sorry, that's my that's quite a bad typo for me. But it's because it's kosher food tax symbols, not fox tax. Dear, oh dear. So don't. So know your symbols. If you Google kosher, if you Google kashrus symbols, you'll get a long list of them. But basically the ones you need to watch out for is the U symbol and the K's. Anything that says kosher, generally speaking, those are the only ones you're going to find. You can actively eat treif foods. So treif means torn, is the opposite of kosher. Classic examples of that are pork, of course, so your pigs, but also rabbit and shellfish are good examples. You can purchase directly from farmers and producers, which cuts out any opportunity that they have to basically steal money from you or coin clip your purchases. You can grow or rear your own, which is again a great thing you can kind of do for yourself. You can avoid manufactured foods in big box stores, because if you do that, generally speaking, you're going to not really hit kosher certified food a lot. And the final way you can do that is when you eat at restaurants, you can eat at restaurants that kind of sell non-treif food, and the food combinations like cheeseburgers are great examples. And the first time before your own time you'll ever hear me say you can eat at McDonald's, because ironically McDonald's is not kosher certified because cheeseburgers. Think about it this way: you can't put meat with milk. What does McDonald's sell? A lot of meat with milk, cheeseburgers. So the classic American dish of cheeseburger is actually a great defense against the kosher food tax, ironically. So with kind of that in mind, if we go to the next slide, sorry. Yeah, I've kind of come up with a diagram here of this is so to give you some idea. We were talking about what is kosher, what is not in a classic cow. It gives you an idea that there's only a part of the cow is kosher, a lot of the cow is not kosher. It gives you a kind of idea that there's a bunch of cuts of the cow that are not considered kosher, so you can eat those, and you know that you're relatively okay, although the cow may have been sacrificed according to Jewish ritual, which you can't control, but you can't control, but you can easily control, but you can do your best. So you've got things like your flank steaks, you've got your short loins, you've got your sirloins and this kind of thing, which you can get your rounds as well. So anything like that, you're absolutely fine with. Just watch out if you like your brisket and your rib steak, you're going to probably hit some more kosher certifications there. And we go to the next slide. So I thought I'd also give you some reading if you want to get everything around this. So the classic book on this is either Stephen Bloom's Postville, A Clash of Cultures in Heartland America, which covers the Postville case, which also has tie-ins to Trump and illegal immigration and corruption. But it's a great concept. It's a great book to read. It's not hard to read. He might be a Jewish author, but he's fundamentally it's a really, really good book. Well written. And I think most people on our side will enjoy it. Sue's Fishcast's Kosher Nation is a good way of kind of knowing some basic facts around the kosher food tax from a Jew who basically is saying this is wonderful rather than because this is really bad. If you want to understand a bit more around how the Israel lobby operates and kind of is a parasitic entity on the Jewish community in the same way, kind of has an interplay with the Jewish community. It's not just a pro. It's not just like an entity that's pro-Israel. James Petrus's The Power of Israel in the United States is a short read, but it's also a very good read and very good on that. And Grant Smith's Spy Trade is a bit older, but it's a great book for understanding how Jews are basically using how they're parasiting on America's economy. It doesn't bring up kosher food, but it brings up a lot of other things that are very similar, like pharmaceuticals and whatever. That also, by the way, are increasingly they're trying to also kosher certify pharmaceuticals. So you can kind of get some idea of how crazy some of the stuff is. You get some idea for just how crazy a lot of this world is. But there isn't a book on the kosher food tax as of yet, although I'm writing one. But it gives you some idea for what you're dealing with, and also how to beat it, and also how to educate others about it. So with that, I'm going to move on to the last slide. We can move on to questions.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much, Professor. We do have some great questions from the audience here. We'll start with 1488 Christian. He asks, do the different sects of Jews have different standards of kashrut?
Yes, they do. And they can differ quite drastically. It's kind of what I mean by when we talk about glatt kosher. Glatt kosher is primarily a thing that's been promoted by particularly the Lubavitch Chabad, among others. So the Postville incident, which we kind of talked about with the with Stephen Bleen's book Postville, and as well as a bit earlier. Also, it's also probably worth pointing out as an aside that one of the people who Trump pardoned very early on in his first term was the Jew at the center of the Postville incident, who's called Shalom Rubishkin, who was part of the Lubavitch Chabad. But it gives you some idea for that. But also, they have different standards. They do adhere to them differently. So glatt kosher is primarily a Lubavitch Hasidic ultra-Orthodox thing. Generally, kosher is more of an Orthodox thing in general. Conservative Judaism has a pretty standard take on it. It's very similar to the Orthodox. Reform is very basic. Isn't a lot of the regulations it completely ignores. It's not. It doesn't want you to buy milk from Jews, or or say that milk has to be produced in Israel, or anything like that, or that if you leave a glass of wine in a bar or a restaurant, if a Jew hasn't been with it, then you can't drink it because a Gentile might have peed in it or something. This is the kind of weird stuff that kind of gets into kashrut. So that they have their own things. Reconstructionist is very much the same. They don't really care too much about kashrut, and seculars in general don't. They just kind of they hold to the don't eat pork, don't eat shellfish, don't eat just eat gefilte fish, and basically adhere to Shabbos. That's pretty much it. If that answers the question.
I think so. I believe it does. Fashbird asks, do restaurants need kosher certification? And if so, what are we looking at as far as an upcharge? How much does this affect the non-Jew and the restaurant situation?
Well, yes, they do. And actually, some of the first kosher certifications came out for restaurants because it's a way of Jews knowing they can actually eat. If you want to see, it's a requirement that the kosher certification be prominently displayed. So if you go to the door of a restaurant, just as with Muslims, they almost always have their certification on display on the door, in the window, or very close to it. If in doubt, you can always ask and just pretend to be Jewish. It does work. And how much the upcharge? It depends. If it is properly kosher, you're probably talking, I don't know, say a steak. You're probably looking at a $5 to $10 upcharge just for the privilege of it being kosher. Something of that order would be what I'd expect. And one of the selling points of such a group would be, it's kosher, it's special. And of course, there's nothing different apart from the cow has been incredibly brutally sacrificed, and then has been dissected and had its lungs blown out and examined and poked by a rabbi, and who's then decided to look at his intestines as well, and all this kind of jazz. So yeah, it's quite a significant upcharge, generally speaking.
Wow, that's quite remarkable. I think that's Modern Viking asked the natural question to come next. He asked, do animal rights groups like PETA ever come out against kosher slaughter? Where are the activists against animal cruelty on this?
They're kind of there, but kind of nowhere. The way to explain that is very simple. Is PETA occasionally does something occasionally does a expose around shishta, sacrifice. So if you go on the internet and you go and search for some of the videos that PETA and groups like it have filmed inside of these organizations, that's why in some respects I asked Flood to use the Eternal Jews footage, because it's nasty and it's brutal, but it's not nearly as bad. If you look at the stuff that is put out by PETA every now and again, and groups like it, you'll probably be sick. If I'm quite honest, it's quite disgusting what actually goes on. As someone who has butchered animals, I genuinely found it. I mean, I mean, I can butcher, I don't know, like a deer or whatever, but fundamentally, the idea that you would do some of the things that they do to an animal is just incredibly bad and evil, and it's hard to look at it any other way. But generally speaking, they are very reticent around it. So they'll do the investigation, but they won't go after Shishita particularly. They go after it. They go after it usually in code. They talk about stunned meat, or they talk about unstunned meat. What that means in polite terms is kosher. It's kosher food. It's kosher. It's kosher meat. And in recent years, the more secular groups have also started going after this a bit more. Particularly groups in Britain like the National Secular Society have been pretty good around this. So have the RSPCA, the Royal Society for the Protection of Animals, Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. They've been quite vocal in recent years around it. But they're very, very careful. The reason why is because it's a traditional target for our side, for us. So nationalists have been going after Shishta since the 19th century in big ways. And there's a decent book by Robin Judd about this called Contested Rituals, where he talks about this. And if you want a little bit of a tie-in to our favorite time in history and our favorite characters, in 1890, in the town of Reit in the Rhineland, the kosher slaughter was banned. And where is Reit? Who is famous for coming out of Reit? Well, guess who? Joseph Goebbels. So it gives you some idea that Goebbels' childhood, he's kind of seeing this is kind of in the background of his childhood. There was a fight between the Catholic and the German authorities in Reit versus the Jewish lobby in Germany over kosher certification, or the kosher certification over shishita and being banned. And so this was something that probably kind of figured into Goebbels' early life as a kind of interesting historical side where things kind of factor in. But it's also traditionally one of the first things that our side goes after. I mean, a good example is it was one of the first things the Third Reich banned in 1933 was they banned shishita. So Jews had to get kosher meat from outside Germany. They couldn't do it inside of Germany. And of course, the Jews went skits. But also, traditionally, it's places like Hungary. Like, for example, after the Hungarian Soviet Republic, one of the first things the new government and Admiral Horthy did was it banned kosher. It banned shishita. Why? Because they realised it's the primary source. It's of the Jewish community. So it's a way of kicking the Jews out without saying you're kicking the Jews out, because you can go after a ritual that, quite frankly, has a lot of ancillary interest to say why you do it. The same is true of circumcision, by the way. It's a classic target for our side because, again, it's completely unnecessary. You don't need to do it, and Jews are wedded to it in a big way. So it makes it very hard for them to defend, because you can approach the issue in a very non-anti-Semitic way. You can say it. I'm concerned about X, Y, Z, and they're going to come out and say it's anti-Semitic and say, well, it's just the truth. What are they going to say? And that's kind of a little bit of some historical tie-ins to it as well for you.
I noticed a couple of very clever people in chat suggesting the same, that perhaps banning kosher food would sort of increase the chances of having fewer of these people around, I guess, long term.
Yes. And interestingly, this is now becoming a thing in Canada, because the Canadian government's going after this. Periodically, the British government is kind of doing the same thing. It's kind of going, well, hang on a minute, this is not right. And the US government so far hasn't. But my guess is, as time goes on, it's going to increasingly become a thing. Certainly, Scandinavian governments and governments in Europe are also very keen to potentially ban this kind of slaughter, purely for what it is, rather than because it's related to Jews. But of course, Jews can't have that, so they go skit, and they also have a habit of aligning themselves with Muslims on this topic, because they always try and say, oh, it's, because Nash is always people who, because you got these people who say, oh, Islam is the problem, blah blah blah. Jews aren't, but then they say because they're not very well read on what they don't understand much. So what they say we want to ban halal food, we want to ban halal slaughter, and within minutes usually they hit the thing that, oh, halal slaughter is not as bad as shishita, and shishita is the origin of halal slaughter. So you can't ban halal slaughter without banning shishita. But they love Jews. Thus, they're presented with a catch-22, and they don't know what to do about it. So they end up kind of wandering off rather confused, because they're like, well, I thought Jews were the enemies of Muslims rather than being the origin of it. So
it's a very good
it's
point.
kind of a fun thing.
Very good point. So Fashbird, I'm going to skip ahead here because she's got a couple of questions. I think these tie pretty close together. Her first question is, are the chickens that Jews use during Kapparot, are they kosher? And this leads to kind of her second question, which is, are these slaughtered animals basically sacrifices?
Yes. So if you want to know about Kapparot, Fashbird, so the way it works is they get the chicken, they swing it around their head, and they do their sin prayers, because it's the representative hen sacrifice. And then what happens is immediately the Jew takes a knife or a razor blade and slits the chicken's head, the chicken's throat, usually chops their head off. And basically, it's an animal sacrifice in any other way of putting it. And then the meat of the chicken is then traditionally given to the poor to be eaten. Sometimes it's given to non-Jews to be eaten because the Jews don't want to eat it, because it has all their sins in it. So yeah, that's basically it's very much a ritual sacrifice.
The dirty underlying mystical meaning of so much of this, it permeates the whole subject, which is, I suppose, typical at this point.
Yes.
Night Nation has a great question, and this one's probably a whopper. What is the total money that they raise? Do you have any idea what their the total take is annually on these kinds of programs? How much actual money do they soak us?
We don't know, because a lot of these programs, is Nick referring to the government grants, or is he referring to just cash repair?
Well, I suppose the government grants would factor in as well, but because all of it costs us. But I think the question was particularly, just on food sales is kind of what we think of when we think of a tax. But this is far more than a tax; it's a massive racket.
Well, yeah. So you've got the government grant is that's to give you, just in case you missed it, Nick. It's 300. That's 300 million. That's the new one. That's just for 1 year. But in terms of how much, we don't know. We don't know how much they actually take. What we do know is we know that they claim they're only making a couple hundred million in general. The industry itself is the actual kosher specific bit of the industry is only worth around 20 billion. But if you get into the actual, how much they try and how much of stuff they actually try and certify, or what they certify, you're talking 280, 290 billion. So my guess is we're talking several billion here. We're not talking chicken feed. We're talking a lot of money, because that kind of shows in the fact of how many Jews are trying to jump into this pile. In the every year we get a couple of new groups, a couple of new organizations that try and pick your pocket, and they can be obscure, tiny little groups. It doesn't matter. They're all doing it. So it suggests very, very strongly that there's a lot of money kicking around. We don't know, because none of these groups are keen to share their finances. We don't know how much. But it's also worth remembering that all these organizations are not-for-profits. They don't pay tax. So they're busy they're busy basically clipping coins out of your pocket and out every which way, and they don't pay anything back. It all goes to them or to Israel.
The coin clipping analogy is very apropos.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I mean it's a great stereotype. That I made an observation, maybe not so much a question, but it's kind of an interesting idea. I think it seems that with the kosher food, that the animals that we consider this, terrible for animals, but we're really the animals in this situation. We're the animals that are paying for, uh, you know, uh, a lightened load for them to eat free for premium food. It's almost as though to them the animals are just food, but to them we're the ones that are the animals that are doing the work and paying for this.
Yes, in essence, because essentially you've got to look at it this way: is they view us as being less than human. We are we're kind of like soulless vessels that we just basically we wander around the earth. We're kind of like um, we're kind of like humanoids or factotums that they can just do what they like with, and we don't matter because we are not really human. We're just like it's like kind of like how they used to think about animals. So one of the old theories to do with animals emotions, animals feelings and whatever was that they were simulacrum. They weren't actually real. That when basically a rabbit screamed as you were killing it, it was just because it was a simulation. It wasn't actually real. It was just them pretend. It was them to basically they didn't feel pain. It was just there wasn't anything there. And until that was a theory around, I think, around the 18 mid 19th century, I think. And it gives you some idea for that's how they view us. Like we're kind of these people who are just around, and they can do what they like. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how much we suffer or how much we have to do. Not only is that right that they should make us suffer and do what they like, but it's for our own benefit because we're less than human. It's just it's not something they often say directly. It's something that's very, very implicit in everything they do. That we are this kind of subhuman creature that they can just do what they like with. It's why fundamentally, if you think about it, they actively screw non-Jews all the time. They tend to target non-Jews because they get less problems because Jews view that as being fine, but you do it to Jews and whatever. It's like to do this case with Rabbi Joseph Schwartz and his nursing homes. Why would that? Why would someone do that, and why would Jews defend it? Because the people that were concerned, the people affected, were non-Jewish. They're not really real.
Right.
Whereas Schwartz is Jewish, so therefore his problems, oh, he's been so badly treated, blah blah blah. Okay, and he's basically screwed the government out of $39 million. He's caused, was it 9,000 people to lose their nursing home places. He's cost the taxpayers I think several million dollars to pick up pieces. He's cost, I think it was like 7,000 or 11,000 employees. He's cost them each individual one. He's cost them 8 months' wages in the current environment. I mean, but yet he's the victim. That's the mentality you're dealing with. They don't view they're not. It's why when people say, oh, I know a good Jew. Do you? Do you really? They're
Indeed.
just it's like is it have they are they in fact a good Jew, or are they just a Jew that they haven't shown you their true colors yet?
It's amazing. First Fire 508 has maybe one of the best questions and maybe one of the spiciest ones. So I'm going to save those for last. But White on White asks, when did kosher food first come into existence? And I'm going to guess that he means the tax itself, or I would assume that the idea goes back to antiquity.
The concept of kosher itself goes back all the way to around I think the 5 to 600s BC. So it's a very, very old concept. It's not new at all. The actual codification comes in the Talmuds and the Mishnah, and then we get the various instructional manuals, whatever. But in terms of the actual food tax, the food tax itself really dates from the years after 1918, when some Jew, I think his name was Harold Goldberg, began to try and advocate to get mainstream producers to produce the same thing, but in a kosher format, so that Jews could eat the same food as Gentiles. And this really became a thing in the post-war era, particularly in the 60s, as the economy began to change and how food shopping changed with the advent of the big store, the big department stores, and the big food stores, and the change from traditional city living to kind of convenience and suburban living, and the sort of out of town mall, out of town food stores, that kind of thing. So essentially, it's part of the Jewish response to that. It was invented to basically standardize everything, make it easier for themselves to ensure cash certification is accurate, but also, and it's become over time become a way to charge and to slough off all the costs associated with kashrut on the non-Jews, so that Jews can have their food made a lot cheaper, and essentially, so by using economies of scale, essentially.
Wonderful. So we get to First Fire 508's question. I think this is one of the better ones. He says, is there a resource for us to easily learn the kosher symbols, like the circled K and pavre, I think is the way it's said?
Pav. Yeah, pav. Yeah. Yeah, there isn't a single easy resource, because there's so many of these symbols. But if you Google kosher certification symbols, you will often get a graphic with a large number of them. As I say, the bulk of them, all you need to know is the real ones you need to know are the U, which is the Orthodox Union, the star K, which is K and a star. You've got Kof K, which is a big K, or with a Kof and a K, the K, so KOF, with a dash and then K. And you've also got other ones, like it says, we should say OK kosher. It would say OK and then circle and whatever. Basically, if you know these ones, most of it you know. I mean, if you look on the back of a product and you don't know and it's got symbols on it you don't know, the Islamic one, by the way, is usually D. So it's usually a circle and a D. It's a similar concept, but done by Islam, because they've copied the Jews. So if you see that one, that's what that is. The nine times out of 10, that's enough. Because unless you're buying specifically Jewish food, you're not going to get the other ones involved, really. So I would say learn the couple of basic symbols, and if you see symbols on a packet you don't recognize on the back of one, which kind of look a bit weird, like, for example, when we looked earlier, there was that bag of pistachios, and it has a K on it, and it has a big K on the front. Look up if you see a symbol like that on something, look it up to see what it is, because it might be nothing, but it might also be a symbol of a particular Jewish certification group, because their symbols do change, and each product can have different symbols. But generally speaking, as I say, the U, the K, and the Kof K and the star and the K, that's all you need to know.
Very interesting. I would assume maybe there are probably also like phone apps, like barcode scanners, that could also tell us if there's kosher.
They have their own community ones that tell them if they're kosher or not.
So there's another resource for you to use. Last question. This one's probably pretty spicy, but First Fire 508 just asked directly: is eating children kosher? We kind of laugh, but we kind of don't because we know how serious that is. You know.
Yes. Is eating kosher? That so technically no, but there is a weird little thing in here, which is that the when kosher when so eating cannibalism itself is not kosher, but this is where we come into dark rights and everything that the Truth Nuke produced for us. In that the one of the weird things is that human blood is in fact kosher. So a lot of people will say on the when we talk about the Jewish ritual murder and the blood libel, they'll say, "Oh, you Jews can't eat blood." True, animal blood. They can eat human blood, and they can eat fish blood. They can't eat human. They can't eat animal blood. So can they eat a child? No. Can they drain a child of blood and mix the blood in matzah and eat the matzah? Yes, they can.
It's really shocking. I mean, it's really quite shocking that that technicality just happens to be there.
Yes, and the only reason I even know that technicality is there was because it's in a weird little book on kashrus by a rabbi called Moshe Cohen, published in 2010 actually, and he talks about it. He says, "Oh yeah, human blood is kosher," and the reason why is because when if a Jew had a so if a Jew bit his lip or bit his tongue and it bled, if human blood wasn't kosher, then that Jew would have to engage in full scale, purification in terms of Judaism, which is quite an involved process. So he's saying, well, yes, it's actually kosher because of this, because but the ancillary to point to that is, if it's kosher, then it's kosher in general, because you can't have something that's kosher in circumstance. It always has to. It's either kosher or it's not. So if it's kosher in in that specific circumstance, it's kosher in general. Therefore, you can in fact mix human blood with matzah, and you can in fact eat it and be quite kosher observant.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, that's kind of the end of our questions, but I would love to say thank you very much for spending another evening lecturing us on something. I think a lot of people learned something here tonight. I'm sure they did because I no longer really think of this as just a tax, but it seems to be another full-scale kind of subversive program.
Yes, and it's a very hard thing to a lot of people to know, and it requires action. It's one of the reasons I chose to talk about this was not because um, I think other topics are more important. I think this one applies to our daily lives. It actually hasn't there's an activism element to this, in that you you can do something. If it affects you, you can't see it, but it affects you. But also, you can do something about it, and it's a way of people. People talk about what can I do? Can I help the movement? Blah blah blah. This is a very small thing. You can get rid of this in your life, and don't pay them. And by doing that, you've done something. That's already a good thing. If you do nothing else, you can do this.
I think that's a great point to kind of lead out on is that a lot of people do think there's nothing they can do, but there are tons of small things like this that you can do that disempowers and defunds or these people and takes them out of your pocket and gives you a little more control back of your life.
Yep.
So another wonderful lecture in the books, Professor. Uh,
Well, I was just
if
going to
there's
say thank you
anything,
for having me.
yes, please
Yeah.
do. If anything you want to say, wrap up.
Yeah. So I mean, it's thank you for having me. Thank you for listening, and I hope it's been useful to you all. I have written a couple of articles on this on my Substack. If you want to go and look at them, you can, or you want to ask me a question, please just at me on Twitter or X, because until I respond, because I get a lot of ats. But I will respond in time. If not, you can always log on to Flood's show and just ask Flood to ask me, and he can ask me because he's happy to do that.
Certainly.
So um, I would like to thank you for listening and thank you for your attention. And I hope you found it useful. And I hope you've learned something. And I hope in some way you have been suitably appalled by what's being done to you, and that you're going to take action in your own life to remove this from remove this from your life, so you no longer are basically having your pocket picked by international jury.
Thank you, Dr. Radl. And be sure to follow Dr. Radl on Twitter. Go find his Substack and subscribe. And that will wrap up this Lyceum. We'll raid Night Nation from here. And again, thank you, Doctor. We'll catch up on the back channels.
Okay. And thank you all for listening.
All right. Another fantastic Lyceum lecture by Dr. Radl. And we're still looking for more speakers. If you are an expert at something, if you're an academic or a researcher, if you are involved in any sort of research, or just able to teach people and lecture people on something, if you have something to say and you're qualified to say it, then we offer you the floor here at the Lyceum. And we certainly are looking forward to bringing on more speakers, speaking about all kinds of different topics. There's nothing really off the table or taboo. The only thing that we ask is that you just get in touch with me. You can do that in Telegram. You can do it over on X, or any of the number of ways that you can get in contact with me. And let's talk, right? Let's get you booked. And we're always looking for more people to come. We want this to be the premier place for people to come and learn on the internet on Wednesdays from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock p.m. So thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And I'll turn up the music a little bit and transition us out and say thanks again to Professor Radl.